That psalm there in Psalm 42, as Alvina says, is one of her favorites. And as I read that, I just see the author of that just pouring out his heart to God. And it reminds me of a prayer. And as you know, as I've said and announced this morning, that we're coming up on our 30 days of prayer. And what I want to do is, we've been doing this study in the book of Acts called Church at the Crossroads, and we're going to come back to that next week. But for the extent of this next month or so, I want us to focus on prayer. And I'm going to give you some goals, and if you're not going to be able to be with us on Wednesday, let me just give you a few things. Maybe you're here and you're not looking forward to the challenge of 30 days of prayer. You say, well, I really struggle in my prayer life. It's really dry. That's okay. One of the things that we want to happen is if you don't pray at all or you feel that your prayer life is dry, we want to encourage you to pray more and ask God to strengthen your prayer life. Oftentimes we forget to ask God to help us to pray. If we're truly pouring out our heart, like the writer here in Psalm 42, everything counts. How often do you find yourself admitting to God that I don't want to do this or I can't do this? Tell God that. He's willing to hear that. So we want to encourage you in prayer that way. Maybe you're a pretty good prayer person. You think, I've got a good time every week. I pray for a certain amount, and God is really working in my prayer life. We want you to go even deeper. I want to give you some tools to kind of expand your thinking about prayer, because and I think especially in the area of prayer, we become creatures of habit. And we tend to do the same things over. And I think God is such a God of creativity and imagination that He wants us to think about communicating with Him in different ways. So I want to give you some tools for that on Wednesday. And finally, maybe you are one of the prayer warriors that we have in this church, and you go, I don't know what else is left. Well, in that case, we want you to pray for miracles. If you are that close with God and He listens to you, pray for them, just things that are beyond our understanding and comprehension. So let me encourage you to be with us this Wednesday night as we talk about that. We will spend some time in prayer. I will give you some more direct goals and focus, and I think we're even going to give you a little handbook, not one for each day, but there's just a bunch of tools in there, and you can go through and just pick one out at random and use that. So as we come this morning, I thought this idea of 30 days of prayer, I kind of wanted to give us a theme for that. And I ran across a story, and I only could think of one story in the Bible where somebody got in trouble for praying, and that was in Daniel chapter 6. If you have your Bible, turn to Daniel chapter 6. If you don't, there should be one in the pew, and I think it's page 665. If you're here this morning, you do not have a Bible, we want you to have one. Don't take the pew and leave those, but we have one that looks like this for you. You can come and get this one, or there should be some out there in the lobby somewhere that are this color. Feel free to take that with you. But in Daniel chapter 6 is where we're going to pick up. But in order for us to get some context of where this Daniel chapter 6 fits in the life of Daniel, I need to do a bit of review for you. In the history of Israel, in about 605 BC, there was a king of Babylon. His name was Nebuchadnezzar. And he was bringing, at this time we're past the kings, we're past David. Israel is in exile. There's two different kingdoms, Israel and Judah. And at this time, Nebuchadnezzar is bringing some of the most promising, some of the smartest, the wealthiest, the best and the brightest of Israel, and he's bringing them to Babylon to educate them, brainwash them, whatever you may call it. And he's going to do this for about 3 years, and then they'll go into his service. And this is the story of Daniel chapter 1. And now Daniel was one of those young men, 15, 16, certainly less than 20 years old. And also with him are three names that you will recognize: Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. We'll mention them briefly, but they're not really involved in the story in Daniel chapter 6. Now, one of the things that you may or may not know is that I believe Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are their Babylonian names, because they have Israelite names. Now, Daniel's, that is his name. They changed his name to something else. But just a little fun fact there along the way. So in Daniel chapter 1, he's brought these young men, Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and part of their training was that they go on a special diet of the king's food and eat at the best of the king's table, because, hey, it makes sense, right? The king would eat the best food. And in Daniel chapter 1, it says this in verse 8 and 9, "But Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, and he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself this way. Now God had caused the official to show favor and sympathy to Daniel." Keep that phrase in mind. So this official that's in charge of this, he makes an agreement with Daniel that for 10 days they can eat their normal Israeli Israeli diet, and the other guys that are still there and do eat at the king's table will do that. And then after 10 days, whoever looks the best, if Daniel loses, then he has to eat the other food. Well, after 10 days, Daniel and the guys that are doing this with him look incredibly much better. And I'm kind of surprised that after 10 days, you can tell that big a difference in these young men, because they're going to be in good health anyway. But Scripture even tells us that it was noticeable difference, and this guy says, okay, Daniel, you're right, we're going to your diet. So they all go to that diet. And in verse 17 of chapter 1, it says, to these 4 young men, talking about Daniel and the others, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning, and Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. Now, I think if they hadn't stuck with that diet, they might not have had this understanding given by God. In verse 19, it says, the king talked with them, and he found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Now, that's the names that they gave Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So they entered the king's service. In every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom. So even as this is a sad, dark day in the history of Israel, as they're in exile from a foreign land, God is still blessing them if they're remaining faithful to him. And you need to see that in chapter 1. In chapter 2, the king has a dream, and he wants his wise men not just to interpret this dream, but they have to tell him the dream. Because I often wondered about that. If I tell you my dream, I can make up any fascinating interpretation. But he says, no, not just interpret it, but you need to tell me what the dream was. So, of course, all the king's men can't figure this thing out, and Daniel goes before God and says, he's going to kill us all if we don't tell him. God reveals the dream to Daniel, and Daniel tells the king his dream and interprets it. And then in verse 47 of chapter 2, the king Nebuchadnezzar says, surely your God is the God of gods and the Lord of kings and a revealer of mysteries, for you are able to reveal this mystery. Then the king placed Daniel in a high position and lavished many gifts on him. Keep that in mind. He made him ruler over the entire province of Babylon and placed him in charge of all its wise men. So that's chapter 2. We've seen God do miraculous things in the life of Daniel because he honored God. Now, chapter 3 is the story that you're familiar with, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace. Daniel really doesn't appear there, but the other 3 guys do. In chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar has another dream. And he realizes that Daniel is different than his other dream interpreters and his other wise men, because twice in this chapter, he says, the spirit of the holy gods is in you. Now, this is repeated by the next king's wife in the next chapter when he has the same issue. So Daniel again interprets his dream in chapter 4. In chapter 5, there's a new king. Nebuchadnezzar's son, Belshazzar, is on the throne. And he throws a party, and you may be familiar with this story as well. A fiery hand appears with fingers and writes on the wall. But nobody can read it. So Belshazzar's wife says, the spirit of the gods is in Daniel. Remember, your father used to use him. So they call Daniel in. He reads the writing on the wall, which is bad news for Belshazzar. Says, today your kingdom will be taken from you. It happens that evening. His kingdom is overthrown, and I believe he was killed, but don't hold me to that part. Anyway, so that brings us up to chapter 6. Now, the interesting thing about Daniel is it's not a straightforward chronological history. This happened, and this happened, and this happened. These first 5 chapters have covered a period of about 50 years that Daniel has been serving the kings of Babylon and has been lavished gifts, and God's favor has been on him. Instead, the book of Daniel is a glimpse at these momentous occasions. I mean, these are some fantastic stories, mostly all supernatural events. And Daniel's life is the story of a powerful God using this humble yet still devoted man. So the first thing you need to see this morning is that Daniel's commitment to principles led to his preservation. Remember in chapter 1, he said, this is what God has asked me to do, and I'm going to stick to that. Daniel's commitment to principles led to his preservation. In a sense, God not only preserved Daniel and kept him alive, but he prospered him. Remember? He gets promoted above all these other guys some of them are native to Babylon. He's in favor with the eunuch in chapter 1, who's responsible for their diet. He's in favor with Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar, and now here in chapter 6, we have a different king who's in king of a different empire. In fact, not just was the kingdom stripped away from Belshazzar, it was taken from the Babylonians and given to what we call the Medes and the Persians. So now we have a Persian ruler on chapter 6, and his name is Darius. But because Daniel has developed this pattern with all these previous kings, he still has a great reputation in the kingdom, and they keep him in that situation. Look at verse 3 of chapter 6. Now Daniel so distinguished himself among the administrators and the satraps by his exceptional qualities that the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. Keep in mind, we've changed empires. We're in a whole new empire, whole new king. Yet his reputation is so good that he's also going to promote him. At this, the administrators, the other guys, and the satraps tried to find grounds for charges against Daniel in his conduct of government affairs. Now this is dirty politics, isn't it? Let's dig up what we can find on the next guy, throw it out there. But look what happens. But they were unable to do so. They could find no corruption in him because he was trustworthy and neither corrupt nor negligent. Finally, these men said, "We will never find any basis for charges against this man Daniel unless it has something to do with the law of his God." Keep in mind, Daniel has been in a position of authority for 50 years. How many politicians do you know, first off, that last that long? Second of all, that maintain a reputation like Daniel has. You know, Daniel is one of the few men in the Bible, and the only one I can think of off the top of my head, that the Bible doesn't say anything negative about him. He has no down days. David's little episode with Bathsheba, the episode with David and his entire family. For most people in the Bible, most of the stories we hear, there's something bad that happened. A time when they turned their back on God or looked the other way. Not with Daniel.